Welcome, everyone, as you're joining. Just going to let a moment or two pass for the rest of our participants to get logged in, and we'll begin in just a moment. All right, wonderful. Again, welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today, this afternoon. My name is Odette Falone. I am Inspired Instruction's Director of Products and Services, and I am so happy to be here today to discuss some valuable information about NJSLA for mathematics with you and share some supporting strategies that you can use in your classroom or in your school building to develop the level of rigor in your lessons to mimic what students will see on the NJSLA coming up soon. So welcome again to our webinar, NJSLA Success, Maximizing Academic Outcomes in Mathematics. Let's get started. All right, so our agenda this afternoon is broken down into three parts. We're going to start by understanding NJSLA-M's blueprint and items. So we'll get a chance here to take a look at how many questions our students will be seeing on this assessment. What are the types? What do those types look like? How are they scored? We'll get to answer some of those things as we move through our webinar today. From there, we'll begin to discuss how to maximize data to make those informed decisions. So we'll really take a look at the data through a microscope and talk about how we can make that data work for you and for your students to target instruction. And finally, our last component of today's webinar will be to incorporate NJSLA level rigor into daily instruction. So here we'll discuss some ways to really up the level of rigor in your instruction to meet the level of the standards as well as what's on the assessment. So I hope today that I'll be able to share with you some excellent and effective resources and all of the links and material that we demonstrate today will be shared at the conclusion of our webinar through a handy little PDF that you will receive. So fear not, all of what we covered today, we will have access to moving forward. All right. So we're going to start here with the blueprint and items, as I mentioned, and take a close look at how many questions, what types of questions, all of those little details that we want to familiarize ourselves with as we are preparing students for this assessment. So taking a look here, you'll see the NJSLA-M blueprints for grades 3 to 7. I'll start by saying that our computer-based testing window for NJSLA takes place from April 29th to May 24th of this year. So it is coming up, but you still have time to get yourself and your students prepared and ready for this assessment. So to go through some of this blueprint today, I'm just going to use grades 4 to 5 as an example. And again, you will have access to this link to dig a little deeper and take a look more specifically at the area that you'd like to focus on. But just for our purposes today, I'll start by showing you how this is broken down. So if you take a look in that grades 4 to 5 column, you'll see that students are going to see 20 items in type 1 questions, 20 type 1 questions that are worth 1 point each. They'll also see 5 type 1 questions that are worth 2 points, and they won't see any type 1 questions that are worth 4. If you take a look to the right, though, you'll notice that grade 6 does have one 4-point type 1 question. And if you're wondering what a type 1 question looks like, we will go through all of that in just a moment. Same with type 2 and 3. But just to give you an idea, continuing down that line, for type 2 questions, you'll notice that grades 4 and 5 have 2 3-point type 2 questions, which focus on reasoning, and one 4-point type 2 question, as well as 2 type 3 questions that are worth 3 points each, and one type 3 question that's worth 6 points each. You'll notice that each grade level listed here on this blueprint, 3 through 7, each will find one 6-point type 3 question revolving around modeling on their assessment. So again, it's important to kind of understand where the points lie for these students, what types of questions they're going to see, and really understand what those look like, which we'll demonstrate in a moment, and the frequency level to which they'll be using them. So similarly to our last blueprint here, you see this one demonstrates grades 8 through high school. And I'm just going to use grade eight as an example to kind of walk us through a similar concept. So for grade 8, if you're just taking a look at that type 1, you'll see there's a similar pattern here. 20 at 1 point, 3 at 2 points, and 1 at 4 points. Moving down the list, you have 2 type 2 questions at 3 points and 1 at 4. And then finally, in that last component there, you have uh, 2 type 3 questions at 3 points and 1 6-point type 3 item, just like the other blueprint that we saw a moment ago. Okay, so now that you've gotten an idea of what, the consistency of the test looks like, right? What types of questions, how many there are. We'll take a look in a few moments at what type 1 questions actually look like, how students are going to be attacking those, and then again, similarly, how type 2 and type 3 questions look and what's involved in taking those questions into play. Before we do that quickly though, I just want to share with you some information about the test timing. So if you're wondering, all students will take the test for 180 minutes. So NJSLA will be 180 minutes long, no matter what grade level you are working with. However, they have things divided up a little bit differently depending on the grade level. So you'll see here this grades 3 to 5 unit times. Grades 3 to 5 will have 3 units at 60 minutes each, and they are all non-calculator items. Each unit's going to have a mix of that type 1, type 2, type 3, those type 3 questions that we saw a moment ago on the blueprint. And a similar concept follows for our grades 6 to 8 test timing. So again, grades 6 to 8 has 3 60-minute units, each with a mix of type 1, type 2, and type 3. The only difference here is that 6th to 8th grade students will have a mix of non-calculator and calculator active sections. So the non-calculator type 1 items will generally appear in a section at the beginning of Unit 1, and then the remaining type 1 and all type 2 and type 3 items will appear in those calculator active sections. Now that remains the same in terms of the calculator involvement for the high school units. Here you'll see we have, a different level of stamina and the high school level. So we have 2 90-minute units instead, each having a variety of types of questions. But similar to grades 6 to 8, there'll be a mix of non-calculator and calculator, and those non-calculator type 1 items will appear in the section at the beginning of Unit 1. Okay, so now that we've gotten through our blueprint and our test timing, I want to take some time to explore these item types and talk a little bit about, the how, the what, and how we can compare them to what we currently do. So as we move through and preview some of these items, I'd like you to think about these 3 questions that I'm going to share with you now. And, consider them as you're reviewing and thinking about what you're seeing in these item types. So the first question I'd like you to consider is, how is this question being presented? Really take a close look at what you're seeing in terms of the way that the answer selections are being presented, and everything that's involved with the wording of the question, the language, the vocabulary. How do we see that question being presented? I'd also like you to think about what students need to do to be successful. Okay, so thinking about what they need to already know, the concepts, the skills, in order to successfully answer that question. And finally, I'd like you to think how this question compares to what students currently see in your curriculum. A very important question to consider when you're looking at these item types, because of course, a big theme of our webinar today will be to think about how we can demystify the assessment, how we can make our assessments mimic some of what students will see on NJSLA, so we're able to kind of break down that barrier of the mystery of how this test is formatted and how these questions are asked. And so we want to kind of intertwine those 2 things together. So As I said, we'll get a chance to discover how some of these performance expectations are being assessed on the NJSLA and really think about how important it is to become comfortable with the questions that they're asking, with the format of the test, and that as educators, we need to make sure that students feel the same, right? Exposing them as much as we can to these types of questions and making them feel that comfort using the platform and addressing the questions that they might see on the NJSLA. So I'm going to start with a quick description of what type 1 items involve, and then I'll show some samples to you. So type 1 items, you might remember from our blueprint, the most frequently asked questions on the NJSLA-M. All type 1 items are machine scored. So students input their answer, whether it's through a multiple select or fill in the blank, what have you. But a machine scores those answers for in the test. And each are worth either 1, 2, or 4 points, as we noticed from our blueprint as well. Type 1 items can look a number of different ways. You see here a list of several different options that students might see in front of them when responding to a type 1 question. The first is the traditional, multiple choice, a classic answer selection, right? Where students are provided with 4 answer choices and they need to select one, the correct one. Secondly, students might see a multiple select question in which there are more than 4 answer choices and more than one correct answer. In these type 1 questions, to score correctly, a student has to answer all correct choices and no incorrect choices. So there isn't a partial credit type of thing going on in that section. Drag and drop is another additional piece for type 1 items where you might be grabbing numbers, symbols or shapes and moving them into charts or Venn diagrams to be able to answer the question. You also might see a drop-down menu in which students will click, see a series of responses and select one. You might see a hotspot graphing where students are using a number line or coordinate plane. And then finally, an equation editor where students are filling in the answer themselves, typing it in, and scoring can account for different forms of the correct answer here. So again, there are multiple ways that you might be able to demonstrate an answer, and the scoring does account for that. Okay, so now that we've kind of gone through all of the different ways that the type 1 items can look, let's take a look at some of them in plain sight. And I want you to remember those 3 questions that I reviewed with you earlier, right? So what does the student need to be successful? How is this question being presented? What does this look like in comparison to what's in your curriculum currently? So this type 1 item that you see here provides an example of a 4th grade question, okay? You see something different about this than our traditional multiple choice, possibly. I want you to take a moment and think about what you notice and what you might wonder about this question. So some of you might see that there are several boxes next to each letter choice here. And this is something that I always feel it's very important to point out to our students because it's an additional signal that they're going to need to select more than one choice. In this particular question, I'm sure you noticed they did put in bold that students should select 2 correct answers. Another signal that they're supposed to select more than one is that they see squares here next to the answer choices. The traditional multiple choice with 4 choices in which you are to select one, they'll see something different. So that's something important to point out, and I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. But here you see that they are to select 2. This is a multiple select question. In grades like 3rd and 4th, the assessment will tell them exactly how many choices they need to select, in this case 2. As students start to move up to, the upper grade levels, the question will begin to say things like select all that apply and may not give them the number of correct answers that they need to select. So that's something important to recognize as well in terms of the level of rigor that increases. This is another type 1 item. This one has multiple parts, so will be worth more than 1 point. Here, a part A and a part B. But you can see there's two different types of responses that are going to be included. Part A includes an equation editor where students are going to be typing in their answer into the box. Part B, you see here, now is a multiple choice question. In this case, you see circles instead of squares next to the answer choices, and that's the signal that they're only selecting one. This is a traditional multiple choice question. Okay, so again, as small of a detail as that might feel like upon first seeing it, for students, that can be an eye-opening tip, right? Okay, I know it's the confidence of knowing, okay, I'm seeing this, I know I only need to select one. I'm seeing squares, I need to select more than one. And again, um, that little bit of acclimation to the test and the structure and the way that it's formatted really can make a very big difference in terms of how students are going to approach it. Okay, so just switching gears quickly, remaining on type 1 items, but looking at one from a high school level, just so that you can see the difference here. Now we're looking at a 4-point type 1 item. Again, which as you might remember, is not on every grade levels assessment, but you would see here in this one, it's only in grade 6 and Algebra 1, that you would see a 4-point type 1 item. Now, what you see here are the drop-down menus that I mentioned a moment ago, and in this case, students would click, and see a drop-down menu appear and have to choose from the selection of responses there for each individual letter for A, B, C, and D for the values of those. So in this case, they're selecting from drop-down menu. And again, this is a computer scored item. So just so you can kind of take a look at some of the different things that you might see. And I hope that you're continuing to think as we go through these, what you notice about the questions, what you wonder, and how it compares to what you're currently doing in your classroom. Okay, so I'm going to spend some time now speaking to type 2 items and just give you a quick overview of what those look like and share some examples as well. So type 2 items are where we start to see something a little different. These are not computer scored, but instead are hand scored. Right, an actual human, right? So these are student-generated answers, and they're usually worth between 3 or 4 points. And type 2 questions assess mathematical reasoning. And there is partial credit that can be awarded for partially correct reasoning. So I'll show you an example of what that might look like as well. It's so important as we start to review some of these samples to think about how you can include these types of released items in your lessons, in your work with your students, as on a daily basis if possible. And I'll share some examples of ways that you can do that in fun, exciting, and engaging ways, and exposing students to these types of questions as frequently as you can. So moving on to take a look at what a type 2 question looks like. Again, what do you notice? What do you wonder? This is a grade 6 type 2 item. Okay, so you might notice that this question is focusing on reasoning. So as I mentioned earlier, all type 2 questions will focus on mathematical reasoning. They'll provide students with something to solve or identify and ask them to provide their reasoning for why or why not something is or isn't. So what you see here is an example of student work. And part A asserts that the student's expression is incorrect. They ask the students to identify the error or errors and then correctly write it in expanded form. Part B does something similar in which they are to, explain whether or not the student's work is correct or incorrect. Now, they're not telling you if it's right or wrong, but they're asking the student to do that themselves and tell the difference if it's correct or not, round it to the correct nearest tenth, and then enter an explanation, provide their justification, right? Their explanation, their reasoning for why they feel and did what they did. Okay, so we will share some excellent strategies soon to help develop those reasoning skills in students because it is a very valuable life skill. It's very valuable on this assessment, but it also, is a very important piece to demonstrating students' understanding about the concepts that they're learning. All right, so I'd like to show you here, a type 2 item rubric that follows suit with exactly the problem that we just demonstrated a moment ago. So you'll see here, this rubric has two parts, a part A and a part B, just as the question had a part A and a part B. Unlike the ELA assessment, all math items on the NJSLA have their own specific rubric. They are all item specific. Okay, so you can see here this rubric demonstrates the exact problem that was within the question and provides a sample student response that would be exemplary. But you might notice that each part is worth 2 points. Okay, so here you'll see in part A, if the student provides valid identification of the errors and then correctly writes their number in expanded form, they'll receive both parts. If they're only able to do one of those two, they can still earn 1 point for this response for part A. For part B, again, valid reasoning, right? Justification, valid reasoning for why the student subtraction result is correct, and then providing the correct difference. So they're earning a point for their own computation as well as for their reasoning in these type 2 items. So that's where the value is in terms of demonstrating that reasoning skill, right? Practicing that and having students really become accustomed to providing reasoning for their work, explaining themselves, sharing the strategies they use with each other. And again, we'll share some great resources and activities that you can use to develop this as you prepare for the assessment. So our final type of question that I'm going to dive into now is the type 3 question. Again, this is a hand-scored question, and these are worth 3 or 6 points. The difference between type 2 and type 3 questions is that type 3 questions assess mathematical modeling processes. Yes, partial credit may be awarded, similar to our type 2. The questions are going to appear very similar on first glance, but you'll see as you read through that students are going to be modeling something in these responses. Okay. So as you are, viewing this question, remember to ask yourself, how often am I implementing questions like this into my math instruction? Are students seeing these types of questions being asked to model in this way? And if not, how can we make that happen? So what you'll see here is a sample type 3 item, a grade 3 sample. And I clipped it all up so you could see all 3 parts at one slide here. The main part of the question here is that John played 4 games. The number of points he scored in each game is written below here. And then there's a part A, part B, and part C. So think for a moment about what you notice and what you wonder. Something you might notice here, of course, that this question, yes, has 3 parts. But you might also see these math symbols within the question. And this is something that I'll share with you on a future piece of this webinar about how to use and how to instruct your students on how to use these math symbols. Because in their justifications, in their reasoning, they're not being able to write things with a paper and pencil. And as you see on your computer or on your laptop, you don't have a division symbol that you can type in. You don't have something that's going to help make mixed numbers. And that's what these tools are for. So it's super important that students are familiar with how to use these math symbols efficiently. So they're not struggling with that on top of having to process the content. We want to break that barrier down and make it so there's as little obstacles as possible so that students are focusing more and more on the content at hand and less on the framework or on the platform of the test, and they're comfortable with that piece. So again, what you'll notice here that there are 3 parts, and I'm going to show you what the rubric would look like for this type 3 item. Similar to our type 2, each part has its own, rubric section. You have a part A, a part B, and we'll have a part C as well. But before I share with you what that part C looks like, just so you can take a glance at these two components, you'll notice that there is a computation component as well as a modeling component. And each rubric gives you a sample student response. Here's a sample, or any other valid response that's acceptable will work. Students can receive partial credit for each part of this question. So for part A, if they're able to give you that computation component, they'll still get the 1 point. If they give you the computation across the board and no modeling, they'll still get 3 out of those 6 points available. Okay, so important for students to recognize that and know that that might be something that they lean on, knowing that they can do, the most possible, and hopefully, get that partial credit for themselves. Okay, so again, part C, similar computation component, modeling component would give them 2 points. All right. So now we're going to take some time to dive into data-driven instructional insights, and I'll get a chance to share with you a few quick tips on how to analyze your data and use it to the best, to make the most of it, right? To get the best bang for your buck out of that data. Um, so I'm going to share with you quickly here um, a sample of a grade 5, test data results. Taken from a graph, this information was organized as NJSLA's reports do in order of difficulty from most to least. So if you can get your hands on that data and take a look, again, you'll notice that the questions are ordered or organized in that way, from most difficult to least, not in the order that they appear on the assessment. Something important to recognize. And I want you to think about, if you're able to get your eyes on this data, how can we use this right now to help us support students in the best way we can with the information that it gives? Of course, this data gives an enormous amount of information to us, and lots of different things we can do lots of different things with it. But I want you to think about and focus on the questions that most students were asked. In this case, we're starting at the bottom here. We see those that are listed on the right side as 46 students were asked these questions in this particular sample group. Questions that are asked to fewer students, they might not really give you an accurate representation. So we want to focus on the ones that most students were asked and most students saw. As you might know, there are different versions of the test, so not all students will see every single question the same. Now, once you've identified that, we want to focus on the bottom third of the questions here. Why do we do that? Now, if you know, as we said, the questions are ordered on this list in order of difficulty level from most challenging to the least. So we want to grab on to that low-hanging fruit, right? Think about these questions here on the bottom. If they are the least challenging, focus on those ones that the most students were asked, and take a look at those standards that are being assessed, okay? Making sure that we can cycle these questions through, spiral review, and make sure our students have mastered them. So we can, again, assure their success in these particular standards and work our way up the list as we are spiral reviewing and continuing to integrate some of these questions into our instruction. And then we want to think about how the question's presented. So we see the standard and the evidence statement that's listed here, and I'll share with you more about what that means in a moment. But the evidence statement will give us information on what exactly is being assessed in that particular question, right? We know the domain, and then we're seeing here the type of question. So how the question is being presented, in what way. And most of these, as you see in this, list, in order from most difficult to least, are type 1 questions down on this bottom third, with exception of one. Okay, so all important information to consider. The evidence statements that are released from the state, I'm going to just quickly show you a sample of one for 5th grade to match up with this sample here. But that provides you with additional information in terms of, what exactly the knowledge and skills that are being assessed in that particular item. So you can match up this code with what's in your data to identify those clarifications. Now, something important to note, I think you'll notice as you begin to investigate the updated NJSLS, the new standards that are coming down the pike, ready for compliance in the fall. These standards themselves include a lot more specific language and examples, and you'll be able to, ascertain a little bit more of what these types of questions are going to be assessing because of the clarity that they've included in the standards. These evidence statements provide some of that clarification for now as we're working with the data that we currently have. All right. So I'd like to share with you this fantastic resource. This is, a public domain resource, but it is created by a New Jersey educator, Grant Colmer. And he's put together this spreadsheet, which again, I will share with you in our PDF at the end of this webinar today. But he's put together this spreadsheet that pulls together all of the released test items and organizes them, as we just saw, in order from most difficulty to least from 2019. And each item is linked with the evidence statement. It has the item itself. You can really get a lot of information from what you see here. So I'm just going to quickly share this with you on my screen so you can get a little bit of a clearer picture of what exactly it is that I'm showing you. So what you'll notice is I'm just using the third grade tab here as an example, but if you see at the bottom of my screen, there are tabs for all tested grade levels from 3 all the way to high school. And if you scan through and scroll through, you'll see, okay, I have my evidence statement. If I hover over those evidence statement codes, I see the clarification of what was being assessed in that question. And then I can see, as I'm looking down the line here, what questions are being asked year after year, or which standards, in other words, are being assessed year after year. And I can just quickly go on to this and click it and be able to open up the question itself that was released from the state. So this is a really fabulous resource. It's organized in a very user-friendly way. And you're able to kind of identify some of these repeated items that you see year after year. You might want to take a look and say, okay, I see here that in this particular case, let's say I'm going to look at line 12, this modeling and reasoning question. Was asked was assessed in 2019, 2018, 2017, 2016, 2015. And you might want to click through and see what did the question look like year after year after year. It might be a little bit different. It's not to say that the question itself is going to be repeated, but the standard itself that was assessed is. And you can see the different ways that they're assessing the standard and kind of, again, integrate that alongside your own curriculum to make sure students are exposed to it. And use that also as a predictor, as you see, as some of these items are repeated, you'll notice, okay, maybe this is something that I want to make sure I'm really focusing in. I'm hitting this home to make sure that students are understanding this concept. Yes, so a couple of you had asked in the comment section here if you can receive a copy of this. And yes, this will be linked in the PDF that we share at the end. So absolutely. In fact, I can actually drop a link in the chat for you as well to get that out there if I can. Okay. All right. So let's just kind of move forward on that. But again, I really think this is a valuable tool and something that can really help to keep yourself organized and moving and looking at some of that data as it repeats itself year after year. So another tool that I'm going to share with you in my handy PDF that we'll share at the end of today's session will include this NJSLA repeated item identification. So this is something that you can use in your own PLCs or grade level meetings or staff meetings where you're taking a look at your school's data from 2022 to 2023 and listing the evidence statement codes or the standards that you see were being assessed in 2022 and then again in 2023. And this kind of thing will help you identify some of the patterns that you might notice and the trends. And again, while the questions themselves might not look exactly the same, you can share these items with your students and really try to, again, hit home that standard as much as you can to ensure student success as they will likely see it on a future test. So really thinking about which standards have shown up year after year, what trends do you notice? We really want to make sure students are mastering those before the assessment. So this tool again is a template that we'll be sharing with you to kind of break down that information for your specific data that you receive. Okay, all right. So now my favorite part is sharing with you some of these research-driven approaches to improved instruction. We'll take a moment now, or a few moments now, to share some strategies that will support the level of rigor found in the standards, but also the level of rigor that's found in the assessment and bring them into your classroom. Again, I say this very often, very frequently, but it's so important for educators to recognize the connection between the standards and the assessment. Of course, we know as we are developing a curriculum, we want to follow the New Jersey standards. But if you really are dissecting them and unpacking them carefully, you'll notice, the assessment, the New Jersey Student Learning Assessment is created based on the standards. The language of the standards as well can be found in the assessment. The questions are created extremely intentionally based on what the standard asserts. So really taking the time to unpack and consider the standards very carefully will help to prepare for this assessment. Again, it's not test prep, it's learning the standards essentially. So we want to keep that in the forefront of our minds, that the level of rigor that students should be working towards in the standards is matched by what they'll see on the assessment. All right, so quickly, before I dive into some of my specific strategies that I'd like to share, I want to point out these three tools very importantly. So you might be wondering, where did you get those student samples? Where did you see, those released items? And I know that spreadsheet I shared a few moments ago has links to a lot of those things. So that's one location that he pulled all of the resources from these three that I'm sharing with you and put them onto that spreadsheet. So they're all housed there. But if you're looking for, a specific piece of, how to practice, these are three go-to tools that I recommend. So the first is the New Jersey Student Learning Assessment practice tests. As I mentioned before, whoops, I get that link up here. As I mentioned before, it's absolutely critical that students are on this website practicing using the platform before they take the assessment. Even if they're in sixth or seventh grade and have taken this assessment several times already in different grade levels, it's important to refresh their memory on how to use the tools. So if I just click quickly on Unit 1 for grade 4, for example, it will give them a feel for what the test will look like, how to move through it, right? How to fill in their responses, how to move from question to question, but also importantly, using these math symbols, as I mentioned earlier, learning and practicing how to create a mixed number, right? If I want to write 8 1/4 here, I know I practice and learn how to do that. If I want to include those dollar signs and division symbols, all right, parentheses or brackets, all of that, and learning how to undo, redo, and delete my work. We don't want this to become an obstacle for students as they're working on the assessment. We want this to feel like as comfortable as writing with a pencil and paper for them. Um, the other items that are included here that you can let students tinker with, play with, practice are the inch ruler, have them practice manipulating it, measuring. There's a centimeter ruler as well, and a protractor, depending on the type of question that you get. So again, if this is their first experience using a virtual protractor, it can really be a challenging task that adds to the level of anxiety and also to the challenge that they're facing. So we want to remove those barriers from their test taking experience by allowing them to engage with it first. There's also additional pieces that you might want to practice with students. And an example could be this answer eliminator. So here, if you teach your students the strategy of process of elimination, students could begin to try that, right? And eliminate answers if that helps them visually identify the correct one. Do keep in mind that the test will allow students to eliminate answers that are correct, but this is for their own process and their own test taking strategy usage. So something that they can use visually to assist them. There's also a bookmark um, tool that if students are really stuck and they want to bookmark it and come back later, they can do that. And the assessment will hold that question at the end before they submit. It will alert them that they bookmarked a question to go back to it. Okay, so there's a lot of different things that, again, we want to make sure that students are very familiar with before they take the assessment. And those practice tests are a great way to do that. There's also the New Meridian Resource Center. This is where you would be able to locate any samples, student sets. Some of those student samples and rubrics were pulled straight from here. So you can filter them by math, as I did, and you can click, let's say down here, on sample student responses. That will bring you to any released student sample responses that they have on this site. It'll provide you with the question, it'll provide you with the rubric, and it'll provide you with several anchor set responses from other students. So you'll see you'll have sample student responses as well as annotated scores. Okay, so this is a fabulous tool that can be used in so many ways within your classroom. Whether you want to start off with using the problem itself here as a do now or a problem of the day, discuss the response with students, take a look at the rubric with them, let them see what's being used to score their answers. And then they can be the teacher. Provide them with some of these student samples, hide the score, which you can see on the top right hand here. Hide the score from them and have them use the rubric to score these things themselves. Discuss with each other why a student may earn a 4 or a 3 or a 2 or a 1. Really get them involved in understanding, how these things are assessed and, what their responses are going to look like and how those things are going to be assessed as well. So those are great for gallery walks, jigsaws, problem of the day, do now, endless possibilities with these release samples. And the third piece here, again, these are all places that I've been able to extract some of these items, is the digital item library. So this again is a place where you can locate any released items from the department, the New Jersey Department of Education. And if I, filter by math, I filter by the grade level. You can filter by standard or evidence statement if you like, but you could scroll right through here and say, you know what, right now I'm working on this standard in my classroom. So I'm going to pull this problem here as my problem of the day. Or I'm going to pull this problem here as my homework question. Well, these two are the same. You'll even notice that there are Spanish samples as well that you can use for some of your English language learners. But again, a mountain of ways that this can be used. And it's lovely that they're organized by standard so that you can easily find things that you're working on in your classroom and reflect them in your homework, reflect them in your classwork, reflect them in your problem of the day, in so many different ways. So try to keep those bookmarked, and they will be linked in the resource sheet I share with you at the end of this webinar. Okay, so I'm going to move through some quick activities that you can use those tools for. So our released items, the New Meridian website, the practice test, you can use those problems and integrate them into your classroom through spiral review. It's so important that students are familiar with the types of questions that they're going to be asked in the NJSLA. And again, this can be achieved by setting up regular opportunities with engaging experiences like the gallery walk or student scoring, as I mentioned a moment ago, but that they're low stakes in nature with the goal of really just building the confidence and competence that they need to be successful. So really, as you're using those tools, be very intentional about the question selection that you have and think about, why are you pulling that sample? Why are you selecting that specific one? To work on the type of item, to work on the standard, to focus on a certain evidence statement? What's the reason? And think about that and consider that as you select. Okay. So some ways that you can integrate that spiral review, which is so valuable. One of them is Throwback Thursday. So we want to keep it, current, I guess, if you want to think of it like that. Students are probably familiar with that phrase, but you can make Thursdays due now or entrance slip a throwback problem that reviews something previously taught. And you can pull those from the digital item library or from, the New Meridian Resource Center that I shared. Things that are going to expose them to the questions that they might see on the test, the language, the format, but it's something on a content that they've already learned. So they've got that throwback piece in, and you want to increase the exposure to that bottom third of standards or questions that you saw in your data. The more that you can expose those students or your students to those questions, those standards, the more you're going to move towards mastery. Okay. So again, try to recycle problems that you know students have struggled with in the past and be very intentional about which problems you select for this throwback Thursday assignment. All right. Another great strategy is Foursquare homework. And I say Foursquare homework, but this can be Foursquare anything. It could be classwork, it could be, um, you know, an enrichment piece, but really the way that it's structured and organized is where the value is. So instead of assigning your students homework with 20 of a similar type of problem, instead bring it down to 4. And you can get just as much, if not more, value out of what they're doing in these 4 problems than giving them a list of 20. Here you'll see in the first square, if you divide a sheet into 4 parts, the first square is going to give them an NJSLA style cumulative review problem. So something like a throwback problem pulled from the digital item library on a standard that they've already learned. The yellow and pink are problems from that day's lesson. So pull 2 from your textbook or your worksheet that you would typically use and plug those into those boxes. And the 4th box on the bottom right can be an NJSLA-M item aligned to that standard. So rather than using a throwback spiral review problem, in that 4th box, you're pulling one from a standard that you're currently working on. So students will see in this little box, side by side, the difference between the content and the problem from today's lesson alongside how it will look on NJSLA or how that standard might look and be assessed on the test. So again, it provides them with a good set of questions to respond to in a very, succinct way. A little spiral for you. All right. So another great activity is Two Truths and a Lie. Again, sounds like something that students probably play, have heard of before, but it provides a great opportunity for you to allow students to practice looking for distractors or identifying the wrong answer. Doing that is a great practice for students in type 2 questions because they're really needing to analyze the answers, process what's right or wrong and why. It also helps practice with process of elimination for multiple select and multiple choice questions. And you can create your own for these. There is a website called Mashup Math. It's public domain. And you can pretty much Google that Mashup Math. It says it up here, but a great resource. And it provides with several examples like this to get you started. And you can start creating some of your own in this way, where you have 2 correct answers and 1 that's a lie. And students have to determine which one that is and explain their justification. So remember that reasoning component that's assessed in the type 2 questions is very important. All right, so another great resource, and this can be used time and time again with any type of problems that you choose, is our Can You Spot My Mistake error analysis activity. So I'd like you to really think about how this activity helps students prepare with type 2 items, type 2 questions. It really ties in very well with the way those are structured and prepare students for them. And like I said, This template can be used time and again, as much as you'd like. And there's a sample I'll share with you as well for how to format it. But the goal of this activity is to highlight and attack those common misconceptions that students have. The creators of NJSLA do that. They brainstorm and work together and think about what are the misconceptions, the common misconceptions that students have. That's where they spark the ideas for, some of the ways that they format their questions. So you, as well as an educator, need to do that. Highlight those, attack them. Think about, where do my students year after year make a mistake in this type of problem? Well, that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to give them a problem and show them student work with that mistake that every student makes year after year, and have them identify it for me. And then explain the error and show correct work and share a strategy. Really just hitting that home that this is an error, this is the incorrect way, let's identify it and let's do it right. So this resource will be shared in that same sheet as I expressed to you earlier. You'll receive this template in which you can fill in a problem, provide incorrect student work in this box, and then students go ahead and complete the remaining 3. They're going to look at that student work and identify the error, and then give correct work. And finally, share a strategy. If they had to explain that to somebody else, how would they explain how to do it? The second page will provide you with a sample. So this is, again, a released item from NJSLA with incorrect student work. And then you have students identify the error, correct the work, and share a strategy. But this, as I mentioned, you can use and create your own to identify those, to draw out those misconceptions and attack them before they happen. Before students start making those mistakes that you see year after year, show them what that mistake looks like and have them come, bring that mistake to light. So this essentially is a type 2 question, just packaged a little differently in a format that you can bring to your classroom, bring to your homework assignments, bring to your centers, however you want to integrate it. But you can pull that information out of your students in this way and prepare them while doing so. Okay, a couple quick last strategies here. This one's called Would You Rather, from wouldyoutrathermath.com. Again, a public domain website, but a great resource to use in terms of finding some of these questions that can allow your students to develop their skills for justifying their response. So as I shared in those type 2, and type 3 questions, justification, reasoning, explanation is so important. And these questions provide students with kind of an ambiguous question, but it allows them to feel the comfort and the low stakes feeling of no wrong answers, right? They're just reading through the problem and then giving a response and justifying it with mathematical reasoning, right? So here you see 2 cakes, 2 birthday cakes, and the question asks, would you rather have a cake, equal slices of a cake from cake A, share that with 8 friends, or equal slices of a cake from pan B with 6 friends. So there's a lot of moving parts in what they're doing here, figuring out which is going to have the bigger pieces. Do they want the bigger pieces or smaller? What's it going to be? How are they going to justify their response? And really here, they're just choosing a path and justifying it. So this is a great, a communication builder. You can use these as discussion starters, using accountable talk or math talk in the classroom, and really encourage students to share their reasoning. There's no wrong answers here. Let's hear each other's responses and think about why, and share why they chose what they did. Okay. So my final piece here has been sort of a theme throughout our webinar today, and that's side-by-side instruction. So with that, I'd like you to just, whenever possible, provide students with the opportunity to see both their classwork and the NJSLA style question side by side. So we'll have that happening in the 4-square homework. But this is another way where you can draw it in. When you're teaching a lesson using your curriculum, your textbook, what have you, you can say, okay, now let's take a look at how NJSLA might assess this standard too. Ask them, what needs to be done in order to be successful in this question? What do you need to know? How are the NJSLA questions different than what's in their curriculum? These are things that you as well as educators can think about. What's different about the format? Generally, we know that NJSLA questions give, that deeper thinking. They involve that deeper thinking. So we want to integrate them when possible, and again, continue to demystify the assessment for students as much as we possibly can. So I'm going to leave you off with a question, with a quotation here from The Rock, Dwayne Johnson, who doesn't love him, but I think this quote just perfectly summarizes, what we've been sharing today. That success isn't overnight. It's when every day you get a little better than the day before, and it all adds up. It's a great quote to share with students. Every day they put in the work, they get a little bit better, and it all adds up to success. So we're going to keep continuing to work and do our best to develop those skills that we need to be successful. So I thank you so much. I really appreciate your attendance today at our webinar. I really look forward to hearing your feedback. I'm going to share in the chat a link to my evaluation form. So I hope everybody can see that. If not, just let me know. But I just posted that into the chat for you. I will also make sure that everybody receives that PDF, as I mentioned, with the link to Grant Coleman spreadsheet, in addition to all the resources that I shared with you, the error analysis activity and everything else. But again, my name is Odette Falone. My email address is here, odette.falone@inspiredinstruction.com. You are welcome to, and I encourage you, please, to send me any questions that you might have. I'm happy to share any information with you that you're looking for in terms of NJSLA. But I thank you again so much, and I wish you all a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, everybody.